The crowd stood outside the cold steel containment door, staring helplessly at Juliet trapped inside the isolation chamber. As the flames continued to spread, they finally stopped worrying about the possibility of toxic contamination. Together, they forced the massive blast door open. Inside, both Juliet and Bernard were barely alive, lying motionless on the floor. But against all odds, they had survived. Bernard still remembered that day vividly. He could never forget the sight of countless residents lining the streets, sincerely praying as Juliet was rushed to the hospital. It showed just how deeply the people of the silo admired and trusted her. Sadly, Juliet herself remembered none of it. Determined to uncover the truth, she ventured alone into the hidden underground cavern, only to come face to face with Bernard, the former mayor who was supposed to have died long ago.
So how did you end up down here?
Before Juliet could even process what she was seeing, Judge Robert suddenly appeared behind her. The story then shifted back to the day Juliet returned from Silo 17. At the time, the lower-level residents had launched a full-scale uprising and seized control of nearly every critical part of the silo. Robert fled with his wife and son into the secure central vault. The bunker contained enormous stockpiles of emergency supplies, and its reinforced blast door made it the safest refuge available to the silo's leadership. But Robert never expected the AI to issue a chilling order. He was instructed to leave the bunker with his son, while his wife, Camille, the head of IT, was ordered to remain behind because the AI had confidential instructions for her alone. Fortunately, the unrest outside gradually subsided after Juliet's return. Robert spent the entire night guarding the bunker with a pistol in his hands before Camille finally came back. Curious, he asked what the AI had told her. Camille refused to answer. She insisted the information was classified beyond the highest level and could never be shared with anyone else. The only thing she was willing to reveal was the truth Robert had already begun to suspect. The AI, not the mayor, was the true ruler of the silo. Every mayor throughout the silo's history had simply carried out the AI's orders. Camille's very first assignment was equally ruthless: eliminate anyone capable of threatening the silo's survival. Those targets were Bernard, Kyle, and Juliet. When Camille asked Robert to help carry out the mission, he agreed without hesitation.
Of the two?
Whoever seems likely to talk first.
At that time, both Juliet and Bernard were unconscious with life-threatening injuries, and both had recently been outside the silo. According to silo protocol, they could have been contaminated by toxic substances. Once dead, their bodies were required to be transported to the furnace on the lowest level for cremation. Robert quietly entered the infirmary. Bernard was covered in severe burns and could barely let out a weak groan. Killing him would have been effortless. Instead, Robert secretly sought out Juliet's mentor, Walker, along with Carla, the head of supply. He proposed an elaborate deception. Together, they would stage Bernard's death, allowing him to disappear without Camille ever suspecting he was still alive. In return, Robert promised to do everything possible to protect Juliet. Otherwise, with Camille's authority, she could have Juliet killed in her hospital bed at any moment. The elaborate cover-up began immediately. Walker and Carla hid the badly burned Bernard while publicly announcing that he had died from toxic contamination and that his body had already been cremated. The news spread rapidly throughout the entire silo. But instead of restoring order, it produced an unexpected consequence. After the successful uprising, the lower-level residents now held tremendous political influence. With Mayor Bernard officially declared dead, they overwhelmingly chose Juliet to become the silo's new mayor. Public support was so overwhelming that Juliet was sworn into office while she was still lying unconscious in a hospital bed. Meanwhile, under Walker's care, Bernard gradually recovered from his injuries. The moment he learned that Juliet had become mayor, he immediately realized what had happened. She had almost certainly been forced to take the memory-suppressing medication, the AI's preferred method for neutralizing potential threats. Robert nodded in agreement. The reason he had gone to such great lengths to save Bernard was precisely because Bernard possessed knowledge no one else did. Before losing consciousness, Bernard had repeatedly warned him that the AI had the power to wipe out everyone inside the silo at any moment. However, Juliet had discovered a way to stop it during her time in Silo 17. The problem was that she no longer remembered what it was. Walker grew increasingly anxious. Is there any way to restore her memories? Bernard's expression turned grim. He explained that every head of IT secretly inherited an operations manual, a guide detailing exactly how to respond whenever the silo fell into crisis. Among its many instructions were procedures for erasing people's memories with medication and destroying their personal belongings to prevent those memories from ever returning. That revelation also explained why historical relics were considered forbidden throughout the silo. Those old objects weren't dangerous because of what they were. They were dangerous because they could unlock forgotten memories. Determined to help Juliet recover as quickly as possible, Robert immediately contacted one of his informants in the black market, ordering him to gather anything connected to Juliet's past. At the same time, he arranged an even riskier operation. Through a trusted intermediary, he bribed the nurse assigned to Juliet, instructing her to secretly replace the vitamin tablets containing the memory-suppressing drug with ordinary sugar pills. In other words, even if Juliet had never begun secretly spitting out her medication, her memories would still have started returning little by little. The nurse Robert recruited ultimately became one of Juliet's greatest allies. Meanwhile, after several carefully worded hints from Bernard, Walker finally learned another astonishing secret. There were 50 silos spread across the world, and every single one operated on its own unique radio frequency. Walker immediately understood the implication. Using that information, she quickly built a private radio system capable of communicating without being detected. At the same time, Bernard tried to win Robert over. He admitted that he had always respected Robert's judgment and leadership. The only reason he had never chosen Robert as his successor in IT was because running the department was the cruelest job in the entire silo. It demanded impossible decisions that earned nothing but resentment. Back when Bernard was in charge, he believed his greatest responsibility was simply preventing rebellious citizens from leaving the silo. But compared to what Camille now had to do, that responsibility seemed trivial. She was operating under the constant pressure of the safeguard protocol, quietly hunting down every person who knew the truth. The psychological burden alone was enough to crush almost anyone. Juliet, however, had no interest in debating morality or responsibility. She wanted only one thing: to recover her memories. Bernard attempted to recreate the circumstances of their last conversation. After learning that the AI could exterminate the entire silo, he had completely lost hope and decided to walk outside to die. It was Juliet's simple reply: "Not necessarily." Those two words had been enough to restore his will to live. Unfortunately, they had no time to continue. Juliet's earlier investigation had already drawn Camille's attention to the abandoned mine, making the hideout far too dangerous. Bernard, still too weak to travel on his own, had to be moved immediately. Walker had no choice but to ask Knox and Shirley for help. Both had always been Juliet's most trusted allies, and if restoring her memories meant keeping Bernard alive, then they were willing to put aside everything that had happened in the past. For the first time, Bernard looked genuinely uncomfortable. When he had been mayor, he had manipulated and deceived both of them countless times. Knox and Shirley simply exchanged a smile. Neither of them said a word. As fate would have it, Kyle and Kennedy also arrived at the abandoned mine while searching for Juliet. But the moment they reached the hidden entrance, they unexpectedly ran into Robert and Juliet.
You need to be very, very quiet.
At last, every major player had converged inside the same secret hideout. To help Juliet recover her memories, everyone gathered every personal belonging they could find and laid them out before her. There were toys her father had given her as a child, along with magazine pages she had collected over the years. She recognized every single item, but recognition alone wasn't enough. None of them unlocked the deeper memories she needed, especially those connected to the safeguard protocol. Kyle stepped forward and reminded everyone that the greatest turning point in Juliet's life had been the death of her boyfriend, George. Unfortunately, Robert's informant had searched the entire black market and had come up empty-handed. Kyle urged everyone to think harder. They needed to find something that had belonged to George, something that meant everything to Juliet. A woman who had known George for years suddenly remembered the watch he had given Juliet when he confessed his feelings to her. Robert carefully retraced the watch's journey. When Juliet was exiled, all of her personal belongings had been confiscated. Bernard had casually passed the watch to Juliet's father. Walker then recalled what happened next. Before sacrificing himself during the bridge explosion, Juliet's father had entrusted the watch to someone else. Just then, Sheriff Hank quietly walked into the room. He reached into his pocket, pulled out the weathered old watch, and repeated the final words Juliet's father had asked him to deliver.
He told me to tell you, never stop being yourself.
The instant Juliet's fingers touched the cold metal bracelet, a flood of memories came rushing back. but they were all memories of George. None of them revealed the secret of the safeguard protocol. Robert finally ran out of patience. He had already been away for far too long and needed to return Juliet before Camille became suspicious. After telling everyone else to keep searching for more personal items, Robert escorted Juliet back toward the mine entrance. Halfway there, he hesitantly confessed something. Years earlier, acting out of personal sentiment, he had given one of Juliet's belongings to his son, hoping it would become something meaningful for the boy. But now, it was time to return it to its rightful owner. The moment Juliet wrapped her hand around the tiny duck attached to the pencil holder, everything changed. She instantly remembered it. It was the very first historical relic George had ever given her. It was also the object that had inspired her to begin investigating the silo in the first place. As scene after scene flooded back into her mind, every missing memory finally returned. She remembered the truth. The safeguard protocol was nothing more than a massive poison gas pipeline running into the silo from the outside world. If activated, it could exterminate every single resident. But the people of Silo 17 had already discovered a way to stop it. They had sealed the pipeline shut. Now Juliet realized there was only one option left. They had to locate the gas line before the AI activated it. Robert instinctively moved to follow her. Then he looked up and met the cold, hateful gaze of his wife, Camille. Neither of them realized that an even greater disaster was quietly unfolding. The safeguard protocol was no longer the only threat facing the silo. Elsewhere, Sheriff Paul met with Carla, the head of supply, and informed her that her newest apprentice, Orla, had been murdered. Carla was stunned. Then her expression shifted to deep regret.
It's my fault.
Moments later, she led Paul into one of the supply department's warehouses. She explained that many of the silo's essential resources had been left behind by its original founders. Since none of them could ever be replaced, they were classified as critical materials. Among the most important were the specialized light bulbs used throughout the farms to illuminate crops and stimulate plant growth. Originally, the silo had enough bulbs to last another 50 years. Now, someone had been stealing them. Their remaining supply would last less than 2 years. If nothing changed, the farms would eventually lose both light and food production. Within 2 years, the entire silo would face starvation and darkness. That was exactly why Carla had assigned her most trusted apprentice, Orla, to investigate the theft. Instead, Orla ended up dead. At that moment, the conclusion became painfully obvious. Whoever murdered Orla was almost certainly connected to the mysterious disappearance of the light bulbs. That wraps up Episode 5 of Silo Season 3. This episode finally delivered the pacing many viewers had been waiting for. With Juliet's memories fully restored, the story is now shifting into its most intense confrontation yet. Although Camille genuinely believes she is saving the silo, her methods place her in direct opposition to Juliet. She will almost certainly do everything in her power to prevent Juliet from disabling the poison gas system. And by the looks of it, Juliet's real enemy may no longer be Silo 18 alone. She may be about to challenge the organization controlling the entire underground civilization. Thanks for watching. If you have your own theories or a different take on this episode, let me know in the comments below. I'll see you in the next recap.